Today, thousands of visitors tour a great house in North Wales, walking in through the grand front door the family used. But Maria Wright, who kept those rooms for 8 years, almost never went through it. She came in by the yard and the back stairs, in the dark, at 4 o'clock in the morning, and her whole working day was built so that no one would ever see her do it. Her name survives even so, in the wage books, in a letter, and on a gravestone. For once, the story of a great house can be told from her side of the door, across a single ordinary day, from the first fire to the last candle. Subscribe and walk this single day with me, from the dark before dawn to the last task after midnight. The woman who lived it left her name behind, in wage books and letters and a grave, and this is her side of it. Chapter 1. The door she never used. Thousands of visitors now enter a great house in North Wales through its front door, the one door a housemaid named Maria Wright almost never used. They come to a place called Erddig, on the southern edge of the town of Wrexham, and they climb the steps, and they walk into rooms full of gilt and silver and a great state bed behind a rope. They admire the beauty of it. They are meant to. That is what the front of a great house was always for. Maria Wright knew that house from the other side. For 8 years she cleaned those rooms, laid those fires, and carried the water that filled the basins, and she did nearly all of it before the family was awake, and by ways the family never saw. She came and went by the yard, by the back stairs, by the narrow passages built into the thickness of the walls. The front door was for the people she served. Her door was somewhere else, and it opened onto the other half of the same building. The house was really 2 houses folded into one. There was the house of the family, all high ceilings and long windows and painted rooms. And there was a second house threaded around it and beneath it, of stone floors and plain corridors and a bell that could ring at any hour. Between the two ran a single door, faced in thick green woolen cloth, which in almost every large household of the time was called the green baize door. Baize is a coarse woolen cloth, and it was there for a reason. It softened the sound of the working house, the clatter of pans, and the voices of the staff, so that none of it reached the family at their ease. A guest might stand in a beautiful room and never guess how close the other house was. Often it was only a wall away. That division was the whole idea of the place, and it was the idea of the age. The Victorians who built and ran these houses thought of society as something naturally ordered into ranks, the few who were served and the many who served. And the great house was that order turned into brick and plaster. A house like Erddig was 2 worlds under a single roof, and the baize door was the border between them. A border a person like Maria crossed 100 times a day, and a person like her employer crossed almost never. Erddig makes a good place to stand and look, because unlike almost every other great house in Britain, it kept both of its halves. When the old way of life ended, most families swept the servants' world away first. They pulled down the kitchens, converted the sculleries, and left only the grand rooms standing. At Erddig, the whole working machine survives, the kitchen and the scullery, the bakehouse and the laundry, the servants' hall and the housekeeper's room, the bell board and the back stairs, and beyond the house the joiner's shop and the smithy and the sawmill and the stables. A visitor can walk the exact spaces a real housemaid walked and know that she was here. And there is something rarer still at Erddig. There are names. The family that owned the house, the Yorks, did something almost no other British family is known to have done so faithfully. They wrote their servants down. They painted their portraits and hung them in the servants' hall. They composed rhyming verses about the cook and the carpenter and the gamekeeper. In 1852, they gathered the whole staff on the steps of the house and had them photographed, holding the tools of their trades, with the family looking down from a window above. They did it again decades later and wrote a long, affectionate poem to go with it. They kept the wage books and the letters. Because of that habit, we can do a thing that is nearly impossible anywhere else. We can name the woman who carried the coal and follow her through a day. Her name was Maria Wright. She was born Maria Hogg in the English city of Chester, and she came into service at Erddig as an ordinary housemaid. In time, she rose to be head housemaid, the senior of the women who cleaned the house. She worked there between 1894 and 1902, in the last years of the 19th century, when the house was full and the family was in residence, and the whole apparatus of comfort ran at full stretch. This film takes one representative day from the heart of those years and walks it, hour by hour, from the striking of 4 in the morning to the last task after midnight. It is worth being plain about what this day is and is not. The record gives us Maria herself, her wages, her promotion, her marriage, the words others wrote about her. The shape of her working hours is drawn from the well-known routine of a Victorian upper servant and from the rooms of Erddig that still stand. Where a detail is documented, this film treats it as fact. Where it is reconstructed from the ordinary practice of the age, this film says so. What matters is that Maria was real, the house is real, and the door she was not permitted to use is still there, with the crowds now passing through it. There is a reason the Yorks wrote their servants down when grander families did not, and it lies in the kind of house Erddig was. The Yorks were gentry, not dukes or earls. They held no title. Their estate ran to about 1,900 acres, and their money came from the rents of the farms on that land and from the coal beneath it. A comfortable fortune, but not a vast one. They could not pay the highest wages, and they could not compete with the great houses for the grandest servants. What they could offer instead was a certain steadiness, a place where a servant might stay for years and be known. And knowing their servants, the Yorks came, over the generations, to record them, until the house held a gallery of working faces that exists nowhere else in Britain. It is one of history's small ironies that the modest house, the one that could not afford the best, is the one that remembered its people, while the palaces that could afford anything mostly let their servants pass into silence. Because the house kept its whole working half, it also lets a visitor feel the ratio that the great house was built to hide, the sheer number of hands it took to keep a single family in ease. A dozen or more people indoors, and more outside in the gardens and yards and stables, all of them turning their days over to the comfort of a few. Maria Wright kept a middling house, not a famous one. That is precisely why we can follow her at all. So begin at that door. Picture it shut, in the cold, long before the town of Wrexham is awake. On one side of it, the family sleeps in warm rooms. On the other side, in the dark, a young woman is already dressing by feel. The day the film is about to follow is hers, and it has already begun. Chapter 2. The Girl from Chester. Maria Wright was born Maria Hogg in Chester in 1870, and domestic service was the likeliest future a girl of her sort could expect. Chester is an old English city about 12 miles north of Erddig, close enough that a Welsh great house drew servants from across the border. She was English, in what was largely a Welsh household, one more small dislocation in a life built on being where the work was, rather than where the heart might have chosen. She was a stranger twice over, once by class and once by country, in the house she would spend her best years keeping. To grasp what she was stepping into, it helps to see how enormous that world was. On the eve of the new century, Domestic service was one of the very largest kinds of work in the whole country. Well over 1 million people were servants, and the great majority of them were women. For a working girl in Victorian Britain, going into service was one of the most ordinary things a life could hold, as ordinary as the factory was for the men of the mill towns. Maria's early rising and long hours were not some special cruelty aimed at her. They were the shape of hundreds of thousands of lives, repeated in house after house across the land, from the greatest palace to the modest home that kept a single maid. A servant entered at the bottom, and, if she was fortunate and hard-working and lucky in her employers, climbed. It is worth laying out the ladder plainly, because an American ear may not know its rungs, and every rung mattered to a life. At the very base of the female side stood the scullery maid, often the youngest and the poorest paid, who rose first and worked in the wet and the cold, scouring pans and pots in a stone room off the kitchen. Above her came the kitchen maids, who helped the cook, and the laundry maids, who fought the endless war with the household's linen. Then came the great working middle of the house, the housemaids, whose task was the cleaning, the fires, and the bedrooms, and among whom there were ranks again, the under-housemaids and, above them, the head housemaid. Above the housemaids stood the upper servants, the cook who ruled the kitchen, and the lady's maid who dressed and attended the mistress. And over the whole female establishment presided the housekeeper, keeper of the keys and the linen and the stores, the most powerful woman below stairs. To climb even one rung of that ladder was the only real advancement a servant could hope for, and every rung was held in place by the approval of those above. Maria came in as a housemaid and set out to climb. The record shows her doing it. In 1895, an early year of her service, she was paid £14 for the year. That was her cash wage, the money in her hand after 12 months of work. It is a figure worth holding on to, because the film will return to it, and because it tells the plain truth about what her labour was worth in coin. £14 a year came to roughly 5 shillings a week, and a shilling was a modest coin even then, so that a skilled workman in a town might earn in 2 or 3 days what a housemaid earned in a week. But the wage, small as it was almost beside the point. And this is the first thing an American eye needs to see clearly about the British servant. Maria was not paid mainly in money. She was paid in board and lodging, in the food she ate and the bed she slept in, both provided by the house and both counted as part of her keep. That arrangement is the quiet engine of the whole system. It meant a servant could not simply pack a bag and leave, because her wage alone was far too small to live on, and her home and her meals belonged to the house as surely as her wage did. To lose the place was to lose everything at once, the money, the roof, the food, and the thing that mattered most of all, which the film will come to in time. There is a temptation, looking back, to make a girl like Maria only a figure of pity. The record resists it. She was a person with a trajectory. Her wage would climb. Her rank would rise. And she came into the house with something the house could use and reward, a capacity for steady, clean, reliable work. What she wanted is not hard to guess, because it is what most people in her position wanted. She wanted to rise as far as the ladder would let her, and in the end, she wanted to get out, into a life and a home that were her own. Both of those wishes were possible. Both of them, the record shows, she achieved. But between the wish and the achieving lay years of the hardest, ordinary labour a body could be asked to give. The life she was entering asked the body for everything and gave it very little back. A servant was on her feet almost the whole of her waking day, climbing stairs, carrying weights, kneeling at grates, bending over sinks. And she did it in an age with almost no machine to help her, only her own hands and a few brushes and pails. A girl often went into service young, still in her teens, and left her own family behind to live under a stranger's roof, seeing her people rarely, sometimes only on that one day off in a month if they lived near enough to reach. Chester was close enough to Erddig that Maria was luckier than many in that regard, but the pattern held. Service meant leaving home to make a home run smoothly for someone else. It meant learning to swallow tiredness and homesickness alike, because neither could be shown, and a maid who sulked or slacked would soon lose the good opinion on which her whole future rested. And yet, within those hard limits, a servant could make something of a life. She had companions, the other maids and the men of the house and the estate, a whole society below stairs with its own ranks and rivalries and kindnesses. She had, if she was good and fortunate, the prospect of rising, and beyond that, the prospect of marrying and leaving. The wonder is not that the work was hard. The wonder is how many young women carried it with a steadiness that their employers, when they noticed at all, mistook for the natural order of things. For now, though, she is at the beginning, a young woman from Chester in a Welsh house, learning the geography of a world designed to keep her out of sight. She had to learn which stairs were hers and which were not, which doors she might open and which she must never be seen using, how to move through a great house as though she were part of its plumbing. She had to learn the bells, each one tied to a room she must reach in a hurry, and she had to learn the hours, which began, every single day, in the dark, in a house built from the ground up to hide the very hands that kept it. Chapter 3. A house built to hide its hands. Erddig was designed so that the family upstairs could live as though the coal, the water, and the food arrived entirely by themselves. This was not an accident of the building. It was its purpose. The great house of the age was a machine for producing comfort while hiding the labour that made it, and every feature of the plan bent toward that end. Start with the shape of the place, because the building has a history that matters. Erddig is a long house of red brick, built between 1684 and 1687 for a Wrexham lawyer named Joshua Edisbury, who reached too far in the building of it and lost the house to his debts. It passed to a London lawyer, John Mellor, who in the 1720s added the two great wings that give the house its present shape, and filled the staterooms with gilt furniture, silver, mirrors, and a state bed, much of which still stands in those rooms today. Mellor had no children, and the house went to his nephew, and from that nephew down to 1973, it stayed in a single family, the Yorks, who by a curious habit named the head of the house either Simon or Philip in every generation. From the front, the house is deliberately plain. The drama is saved for the garden side and for the rooms within. And behind and below those rooms lies the other house, the service world, arranged so that the two populations under one roof would almost never meet. The first tool of that separation was the routing of movement. The family and their guests moved through one set of spaces, grand and lit. The servants moved through another, plain and often dark, a system of back stairs and narrow corridors threaded through the building. By these hidden ways, a scuttle of coal could travel from a cellar to a bedroom grate, and a can of hot water from the kitchen fire to a washstand, without a single member of the family watching a hand touch it. The point of the back stairs was not merely convenience, it was invisibility. The labour was to happen inside the walls, as it were, out of sight and out of mind. The second tool was the bell. In the service passage at Erddig hangs a board of bells, each joined by a run of wire to a room somewhere above, and each labelled with the name of the room it answered. The surviving bells carry the names of the house, among them the White Room, the West Room, the Drawing Room, and the Front Hall. When a bell rang, a servant read the label. knew at once which room in the house required attention, and went. It was a quiet, ingenious thing, and it meant a family could summon a person from anywhere in the building without raising a voice, indeed, without ever needing to know that person's name. Beneath the Erddig bells hangs a framed prayer composed by the master of the house, a small daily reminder to the staff of the household's idea of itself and of the place each person was thought to hold. The third tool was the sheer spread of working rooms, a whole industrial quarter hidden inside a country house. There was the kitchen, the engine of the place, and off it, the scullery where the pots were scoured. There was the bakehouse, where the household's bread was made, and the wet laundry and the dry laundry, where its linen was washed, dried, and pressed. There was the servants' hall, where the staff ate and gathered, and the butler's pantry, where the silver was kept and cleaned, and the housekeeper's room, from which the female staff were governed. There was the still room, a kind of second kitchen where preserves and cordials and simple medicines were made and stored, to take some of the pressure off the main kitchen. And beyond the house, ranged around the yards, stood the joiner's shop and the smithy, where the estate's blacksmith worked the iron, and the sawmill and the stables. It was, in effect, a self-sufficient village, most of it invisible to a guest, all of it there to keep a single family in comfort. The fourth tool was the hierarchy, the chain of command that turned a dozen separate people into a single working instrument. At the head of the indoor world stood two figures. There was the butler, master of the male servants, of the wine, the silver, and the security of the house. And there was the housekeeper, mistress of the female servants, of the linen, the stores, and the still room. At Erddig in Maria's time, the housekeeper was a woman named Harriet Rogers, herself risen through the ranks of service, and it was under her authority that Maria worked. Below the butler and housekeeper came the cook and the lady's maid, and below them the housemaids and footmen and kitchen maids, and at the very bottom the scullery maid and the hall boy. Every person knew exactly where they stood, and exactly whose word could raise them or ruin them. At the heart of this working village stood the servants' hall, the room where the staff ate together and gathered in what little time was theirs, and on its walls at Erddig hung the faces of the servants who had gone before. This was the York peculiarity made solid, a room where a living maid took her meals beneath the painted portrait of a maid dead 50 years, each picture kept company by a verse the family had written in her honour. Beneath the row of bells hung the household's prayer, composed by one of the masters of the house, a daily reminder to family and staff alike of the place each was thought to hold in the order of the household. To a modern eye, there is something uneasy in it, a family that summoned its servants by a wire and then hung a prayer above the bells about duty and station. But it was sincerely meant in its way, and it is part of why Erddig knew its people. The house did not merely use its servants and forget them. It watched them, named them, rhymed them, and hung them on the wall. None of this was thought strange at the time. It was simply how a great house worked, an order as settled and unquestioned as the weather, and the people who lived inside it, above and below the bay's door alike, mostly took it for the natural shape of the world. Set all of this working, and the result was the thing the age most prized, a house that seemed to run itself. In its full season, with the family in residence, Erddig presented to a visitor a seamless picture of ease. The rooms glowed, the fires burned, the meals appeared, course after course, carried at a near run down passages the guests never saw. The gardens were immaculate. Nothing seemed to have a maker. Comfort of this kind appeared to be simply a property of the house, like the height of its ceilings, and the whole design existed to sustain that illusion. And the more perfect the illusion, the more completely the people who made it had to be hidden. At Erddig, in the late 1890s, the illusion was close to perfect, which is another way of saying that Maria Wright and the dozen who worked beside her had been rendered almost completely invisible. The film is about to make one of them visible again. It begins where her day began, in the coldest hour of the house. Chapter 4. The coldest hour of the house. The working day began in the dark, with the scullery maid at her range by 5:30 in the morning, long before the family stirred. But even that was not the true beginning, because the fires that warmed the family had to be alight before the family woke, and the water had to be hot. And so the first of the servants rose earlier still into a house that was black and silent and cold. Think what that cold meant in a house of this kind. There was no warmth anywhere that a servant had not first made. The grand rooms held the ashes of last night's fires, grey and dead. The passages were unheated. The attics where the maids slept had no fires of their own. So the day opened with a young woman swinging her feet onto a cold floor in a cold room in the dark, dressing by feel or by the light of a single candle, and going down by the back stairs into a house where the only warmth was the warmth she was about to create for other people. Winter made this ordeal sharper, when the water in the ewer might have a skin of ice on it and the breath showed in the air of the attic. But even in the milder months, the pre-dawn house was a cold place to rise into, and rise into it she did. The scullery maid was first and lowest, and hers was the coldest start of all. By about 5:30, she was at the great iron range in the kitchen, the huge cast-iron cooking range that was the heart of the house's food, raking out the dead ashes of the day before, laying and lighting the fire that every other kitchen task depended on, and setting the first water to boil. Everything the kitchen would do that day, every pot and every kettle, waited on that fire catching. She worked in a stone scullery off the kitchen, at the sink, among the pans, in the wet and the chill, and she did it before most of the house had so much as turned over in bed. She was often the youngest servant under the roof, sometimes a girl in her early teens, far from her own family, and she was paid the least of anyone in the place. The housemaids rose into the same dark not long after. Their first work was the work of fire and water, the round that had to be finished before the family opened their eyes. It was a labour measured not in tasks, but in journeys, up and down the back stairs, again and again, in the cold. The mistress of the house was to wake to a warm room. The gentleman was to shave in hot water that had appeared at his door. The guests were to come down to rooms already glowing. None of them were to see or think about the girl who had made it so, and that was the point of doing it in the dark. Set the hours against each other, and the shape of the thing becomes clear. The family might rise at 8 or 9 or later at their own pleasure. The servants who made that leisurely waking possible had by then been at work for 3 or 4 hours. A guest who slept until 9 had been served, in effect, since before 6, by people he would not have recognized if he passed them on the stair. That gap of 3 or 4 hours between the first servants rising and the first guests is the plainest measure the film can offer of how the house really worked. The comfort of the late riser was built on the dark hours of the early one, and the later the family slept. The earlier the servants had risen to make the sleeping possible. The cold is the detail to hold on to, because it carried a cruelty the family never intended and never noticed. The maid who lit the fire did not stand and warm herself at it. She moved on, to the next grate, and the next, carrying warmth from room to room like a servant carrying dishes and keeping none of it. The warmth she made was not hers. It belonged, like her wage and her bed, to the house. She would spend the whole of a long day surrounded by fires she had lit and rooms she had heated, and at the end of it, She would climb to an attic with no fire at all. There is a hard little symmetry in that, the maker of warmth living without it, and it sits at the very centre of the servant's life. The order of that first hour was fixed by long custom and by the plain logic of the work. The maid came down and first opened the shutters and blinds of the lower rooms to let in what light there was. She took up the hearth rugs so they would not be soiled by the ash. She dealt with the grates before anything else, because a fire takes time to catch and give its heat, and the rooms had to be warm by the time the family came down. Only then could the rest follow, the sweeping and the dusting and the carrying. In summer she might rise at 6 or a little before, but in a great house with a family in residence the rising crept earlier, and in the depth of winter, when the mornings were blackest and coldest and the fires most needed, she rose into the worst of it, feeling her way down unlit stairs with a candle, her hands stiff before the work had even begun. The season changed the hardship, but never removed it. There was always a fire to be raised in the cold, and a family to be kept from ever knowing how the warmth was made. By the time the family's bells began to ring for the day, then the hardest physical hours were already spent, and spent by the people least likely ever to be thanked for them. And there was no gentle easing into the day, no first cup of anything taken at leisure. The work was there the moment the eyes opened, waiting in the dark, and it did not care whether the body was rested, or sick, or grieving, or young. This was the hour that set the tone of everything to follow. Before the town was awake, before the first light, before the family had any notion that the day had begun, the house was already at work in the dark. A scullery maid bent over a cold range. Housemaids moved on the back stairs with the first loads of the morning. The machine had started, and the largest single labour of that early hour, the one that turned the cold house into a warm one, was only just beginning to be carried, grate by grate, up the stairs. Chapter 5. The morning warmth made by hand. Every warm room the family woke to had been made by hand, grate by grate, by housemaids carrying coal and hot water up the back stairs. There was no other way. In a house like Erddig, warmth was not a thing you switched on. It was a thing a person built, one fire at a time, kneeling on cold hearths in the half-dark, and then carried through the building on her own 2 arms. The work began at the grate, and a dead fire is a filthy thing, so clearing it was the first indignity of the morning. The maid knelt, spread a cloth to protect the carpet, and raked out the cold ashes of the night before, gathering the cinders that could be burned again and carrying the rest away. Then came the blackleading, the daily labour of cleaning and polishing the iron of the grate with a black paste and a set of stiff brushes so that the metal came up dark and gleaming. Every housemaid carried a box for this work, fitted with her brushes and her leathers and her cloths and her tin of black lead, and the box went with her from room to room like a soldier's kit. It was dirty work, and it marked the hands and the apron, which is one reason the morning was done in a plain print dress that could take the mess. Only when the grate was clean and gleaming could she lay the new fire, the paper and the kindling and the coal, and set it alight and move on, leaving the flames to do the rest. Now multiply that single grate by the number of rooms in a great house, and the size of the morning comes into view. The reception rooms, the bedrooms, the dressing rooms, the passages that warranted a fire. Each one wanted its dead ashes cleared, its grate blacked, its new fire laid and lit, and each one wanted it done before its occupant appeared. In a full house that could mean dozens of fires, each the work of many minutes on cold knees, all of them to be finished inside the same small window before the family rose. This was not the work of a moment. It was the work of hours, repeated grate after grate. and it was only the first half of the morning round. The second half was water, and water is heavy. Running hot water in the walls was a luxury most great houses of the period did not have, so the water was heated below, at the kitchen fire and its boilers, and then carried up. It went in metal cans, filled and lidded and lifted, up the back stairs and along the passages to the washstands and basins of the bedrooms. A single can of water is a real weight to lift. A house full of them, delivered floor by floor, morning and night, was a punishing thing to move, and it was the housemaids who moved it, one trip at a time, their arms and backs taking the strain of every gallon. The gentleman who dipped his razor in warm water, the lady who washed her face, were dipping into a labour they never saw, that had climbed the stairs to reach them in the dark. Here is the scale of it, set down in plain terms. A great house in full residence might keep a dozen or more indoor servants at work, a good share of them women doing exactly this kind of labour. Between them, on a cold morning, they would clear, black, and light a great many fires, and carry many heavy cans of hot water up many flights of stairs, and empty and carry down the used and dirtied water and the waste of the night, and all of it inside the 2 or 3 hours before the family rose. The mistress woke to a warm room she had not warmed. The guest woke to hot water he had not heated. The maid who had done both was already 3 hours into her day, with the whole of it still ahead of her. There was skill in it too, not just labour, and the skill went unremarked, because the whole point was that no one should notice the work at all. A well-laid fire that caught first time and did not smoke, a grate blacked to an even shine, a room dusted and set right without a thing disturbed, water brought hot and on time. All of this took a trained hand and a fast one. A clumsy maid, one who was slow or who left a room less than perfect, or who was seen when she should not have been, would soon hear of it, and a servant who heard of it too often would not keep her place. So the work was done well, and quickly, and silently, by young women who had learned to be both invisible and excellent at once. And every journey up had its journey down. The same maids who carried clean hot water up the back stairs carried the dirty water down again, the used washing water and the waste of the chamber pots, emptied and rinsed and returned, so that the traffic on the servants' stairs ran both ways all morning, clean going up and soiled coming down, and none of it seen. There was danger in the work, as well as weariness. The ranges and the boilers were fierce with heat, the water scalding, the coal heavy, and the scuttles awkward, the stairs steep and often ill-lit, and a slip with a full can or a fall on the back stairs was a real risk run daily by tired young women moving fast in the half-dark. It is easy, looking at the calm, finished rooms, to forget that the making of that calm was hot, heavy, sometimes hazardous labour, carried out against the clock by people who could not afford to be seen doing it. Multiply one maid's morning by the several who shared the work, and then by the 300 and more mornings of a working year, and the true size of the labour behind a warm house comes into view. It was the same heavy round, done again and every single day of the year, until the doing of it was simply the shape of a life, and when the round was done, the reward was not rest. It was the next thing. The family came down to breakfast, and the beds they had left needed making, and the rooms they had left needed cleaning, and the bells began to ring. But for one brief moment, at the join between the dark morning and the ordinary day, the house stood transformed. Every fire the maids had knelt to was burning. Every basin they had climbed to was full. The illusion the whole building was designed to produce, the illusion of a house that simply woke up warm, was complete. It had been made, that morning as every morning, by a small number of tired women moving in the dark. and by the time anyone above stairs opened their eyes, those women had already made themselves scarce. The warmth stayed. The people who made it were not to be seen, and for that unseen labour, the house paid a wage so small it is worth stopping to count. Chapter 6. The wage that bought a whole life. For all of this labour, the house paid Maria Wright £14 in her first recorded year, rising in time to 20. Those are not guessed figures. They are written down, year by year, in the Erddig records, and they let the film do the thing numbers do best, which is to make an abstraction solid. The abstraction is the value the age placed on a servant's whole working day. The solid figure is this. At the height of her position, Maria Wright was paid, in cash, £20 a year. Follow the climb, because the climb is real and it matters. In 1895, she was paid £14. In 1897, £16. In 1898, £18. And in 1899, the year she rose to head housemaid, £20. And that £20, the record notes, came on top of all her meals and her lodging, which the house provided. So across 4 years, her cash wage climbed by £6. That was a genuine advancement, a real reward for reliable work, and it should be seen as one. It was also, at its peak, £20 a year, which is to say about 8 shillings a week, for a working day that ran from before dawn to after midnight, 6 days out of 7. Set that wage in its world, and its smallness comes into focus. In the same years, in a comparable household, a housemaid's pay ran somewhere between £8 and £20 a year, so Maria, at 20, stood at the very top of her trade. A lady's maid, who dressed the mistress and enjoyed higher standing, might be paid between £10 and £25. A footman, one of the male servants who waited at table and answered the door, about 26. And the butler, the most senior indoor servant of all, might be paid about £58 a year, near enough 3 times what the head housemaid earned. A hall boy, the lowest of the men, the boy who did the roughest errands, might get 10. Lay those figures side by side, and the whole shape of the house is there in coin, the women beneath the men, the young beneath the old, the workers beneath the servers, all of it fixed in a ladder of pounds that everyone understood and almost no one questioned. But the wage, as the film has said, was almost the smallest part of what a servant was paid, and now the reason can be made plain. The true payment was the keep, the food, and the bed, taken out of the running of the house. That is what made the small wage livable, and it is also what made the servant unfree. The cash was too little to live on alone. The home and the meals belonged to the house. And so a servant did not really have a wage in the way a modern worker has a wage, a sum she could take and spend and build a separate life around. She had a place. And a place could be taken away, at a month's notice or less, by a single word from above. And with it went the wage, the roof, and the food, all together. Which brings the film to the thing that was worth more than any wage, and that governed a servant's whole life more completely than money ever could. It was the character, the reference, the written word of the people above you that you were honest, sober, hard-working, and fit to be trusted in a good house. Without it, a servant could not get the next place, because no respectable household would take a maid who could not produce a good character from her last employer. And a servant without a place had nothing at all, no wage, no roof, no food, and no way back into the only trade she knew. The character was the real currency of service, and it could be withheld or destroyed in an instant by a single displeased employer, for a reason, fair or unfair, with no appeal. Erddig gives us Maria's character in a living sentence. When she was raised to head housemaid, the housekeeper, Harriet Rogers, wrote of her with approval. She said that she was so pleased to hear Maria had been promoted, and that she had always found her such a nice, clean, respectable girl. Nice, clean, respectable. Read cold, they are small words. Read in their world, they are enormous. Those 3 words were Maria's entire professional standing, the sum of what the house would say of her to the next house, the key that opened every door in front of her. A servant lived or fell by whether the people above her would call her nice, clean, and respectable. Maria had earned all 3 in writing from the most powerful woman below stairs, and that plain sentence in a private letter was worth more to her future than a year of wages. It is hard, across the distance of more than a century, to feel what £20 a year truly was, so set it against the life around it. Out of that wage, a servant had to clothe herself, for the house gave her keep, but rarely her whole wardrobe, and she was expected to appear always neat and clean. Out of it, she might try to save a little against the day she could no longer work, for there was no pension waiting, no safety beyond her own thrift and her family. A servant who reached old age without savings and without kin to take her in faced the workhouse, the grim public refuge of the destitute, and the fear of it sharpened every economy. So the wage that looked so small was smaller still in what it had to cover, and the keep that came with it, the food and the bed, was a plain necessity rather than a kindness, the only thing that made the arithmetic close at all. Harriet Rogers, who wrote so warmly of Maria, had climbed this same hard ladder herself, from the lower ranks to the housekeeper's room, and she knew to the penny what a good word was worth to a young maid, which is perhaps why she gave Maria hers so readily. So the arithmetic of her life stands complete. £20 a year in cash, at the very top. Her keep in food and bed, which she could not do without and could not take with her. And, worth more than either, 3 words in a letter, which cost the house nothing to give and meant everything to receive. That was the price of a day that began at 4 in the morning, and the instrument that enforced it, that turned the price into a claim on every waking hour, hung waiting in the service passage, and it was already beginning to ring. Chapter 7. The Bell That Could Not Wait. In the service passage hung a board of bells, and when one of them rang, there was no such thing below stairs as being off duty. That board is one of the truest objects in the whole house, because it is the machine of command made visible. A row of bells, each on its wire, each labelled with a room, each able to reach into the servant's world at any moment, and pull a person out of whatever she was doing and send her up the stairs. It is still there at Erddig today, and a visitor can stand beneath it and read the names of the rooms, the White Room, the West Room, the Drawing Room, the Front Hall, and imagine the jangle of it running through a working day. Picture how it worked in the ordinary run of things. A member of the family, in a room somewhere above, wanted something. A fire built up, a tray brought, a curtain drawn, a letter taken. He reached for a bell pull, a cord or a handle by the fireplace, and far below, in the passage, a bell jumped on its spring and rang, and its label told which room had called. A servant read the label and went. No name had to be spoken. No voice had to be raised. The person upstairs did not need to know who would come, only that someone would, promptly and without fuss. The bell turned the servant into a function of the house, summoned by the pull of a wire, present when wanted and gone when not. And the bell could ring at any hour. That is the heart of it. There was no fixed point in the day at which a servant was released, no line past which her time was reliably her own. In the servants' hall, being present meant being available, and a bell that rang during a snatched meal, or late in the evening, or in a rare spare half-hour, had to be answered exactly as promptly as one that rang at noon. The work was not a set of hours with a beginning and an end. It was a readiness that lasted as long as the family was awake, and sometimes longer, a state of always listening for the summons that might come at any moment from any room. Around that readiness, the house wrapped a set of rules whose strangeness is easy to miss, because it seems almost natural until you say it plainly. The servant was, as far as possible, not to be seen. The whole architecture of back stairs and hidden passages served that end, and in the grandest houses the rule was written down and made absolute. At Woburn Abbey, the seat of one of the great ducal families, the rule ran that no female servant was to be seen after the middle of the day. At Crewe Hall, another great house, the rule was that no housemaid was to be seen anywhere at all except in the chapel. Think about what those rules asked. They asked a human being to do the work of the house and then, in effect, to disappear, to become a thing that acted on the rooms without ever being present in them, a pair of hands with the person attached, kept carefully out of view. Erddig, in fairness, was a gentler house than those. It was owned by a family who painted their servants and wrote them into verse, who knew their names and recorded their faces, and who seemed to have taken a real, if unequal, interest in the people who served them. It did not, so far as the record shows, forbid its maids to be seen. But the same principle shaped its plan and its day, because the principle was the point of the whole design. The servant was to do the work and vanish. The bell was to be answered, and the answerer to melt away. Comfort was to arrive as if by itself, and a house built on that principle laid a total claim on the person who served it, gentleness or no gentleness, because the gentleness never touched the arithmetic of the hours. There is a particular strain in a life lived always at the edge of a summons, and it wore on the nerves as surely as the carrying wore on the back. A servant learned to keep half her attention forever on the passage where the bells hung, so that even in a quiet moment, even at her own meal, part of her was listening. The rules of invisibility added their own quiet weight. In many houses, a servant who met a member of the family in a corridor was expected to stop and turn to face the wall, to make herself as absent as a person present could be, until they had passed. She was to be a pair of hands and not a face, a service and not a presence. And the strangest part is how thoroughly it worked. A whole class of people learned to move through the grandest rooms in the land while contriving never to be part of them, present everywhere and seen nowhere, until their absence from the family's view came to seem as natural as the furniture. The bell rang, and a person appeared, and did the thing, and was gone, and the family scarcely registered that a person had been there at all. To spend years being trained out of one's own visibility is a strange and telling thing to ask of a human being, and it was asked, in one form or another, of every servant in every great house in the land. Now weigh the one relief against the whole burden. For all of this, the day beginning before dawn, and the readiness lasting past midnight, and the rule of near invisibility, the most a servant could commonly expect by way of freedom was a single day off in a month. One day in 30 in which the bell was not hers to answer, in which she might walk out of the gates and be, for a few hours, simply a young woman rather than a summons waiting to be rung. The other 29 days belonged to the house, from the cold grate at 4 in the morning to the last errand at night. That is the claim at its fullest, and it is the point of maximum pressure in Maria's day, the moment to feel the size of what the house asked. It asked, in return for a bed, her food, £20, and 3 good words, the whole of her waking life, made invisible and available at the pull of a wire. The remarkable thing is not that servants resented this, though some did. The remarkable thing is how many of them, Maria among them, lived inside it with dignity, did the work well, earned the good words, and climbed. The bell ruled the day, but the day, even so, was still hers to get through, and there was a great deal of it left. The morning round was over. The long middle of the day was about to begin. Chapter 8. The long middle of the day. By the middle of the day, the beds were stripped, the rooms were dusted, and the maids changed into clean afternoon dress for lighter work. This was the part of the day the paintings never show and the dramas rarely dwell on, the long, unglamorous core of the housemaid's labour, the hours between the dawn fires and the evening dinner. It had no spectacle in it. It was simply the endless upkeep of other people's lives, and it filled the middle of every day with 100 small tasks that had to be done and would have to be done again tomorrow. Once the family had risen and gone down to breakfast, the bedrooms came into the maids' hands. The beds had to be stripped and aired and made afresh, the sheets pulled tight, the heavy covers straightened, the pillows turned and beaten. It sounds slight until you remember that these were large beds in large rooms, and that a made bed had to be perfect, and that there were many of them. The washstands had to be cleared, and here was one of the day's plainer duties, the emptying and scouring of the bedroom china, the basins and the ewers and the chamber pots, in an age when a great house had no bathroom on every floor, and the most private needs of the family were carried away, quietly, by a girl with a pail and a cloth. It was close and humbling work, and it was hers, and no one above stairs ever thought about who did it or how. Then came the cleaning proper, the daily dusting and sweeping and tidying of room after room, and on top of that, the rotating labour the maids called the special work, the deeper cleaning that could not be done every day and so was parcelled out across the week. One day, the windows. Another, the grates given a harder scour. Another, the polishing of the furniture with beeswax, or the brushing and beating of the carpets, or the turning out of a whole room from top to bottom. Everything moved, cleaned behind, and set back exactly as it had been. The house was large, and every surface in it wanted attention, and the attention it wanted never ended, because a house lived in is a house always being undone. What a maid cleaned on Monday was waiting for her again by Thursday, and the work had the particular weariness of labour that leaves no lasting mark, since a room perfectly cleaned looks exactly like a room about to be cleaned again. Through all of this ran the service of meals the servants prepared and carried, but did not share. The family ate. The maids and footmen fetched and cleared. And the food itself marked the border between the two houses as sharply as any wall. Upstairs, a table of plenty, several dishes at a sitting, the best of what the estate and the markets could provide. Downstairs, the servants ate their own plainer meals at their own times, often in 2 sittings by rank, the upper servants apart from the lower, and always with an ear open for the bell. A maid's meal might be taken quickly, half standing, and abandoned in a moment if a bell rang above. The abundance the servants handled all day was not for them, and the line between what went up and what came down was one of the sharpest lines in the house. At a certain point in the afternoon came a small ceremony that tells the whole story of the servants' place in miniature. The housemaid changed her dress. The morning had been for the dirty work, the fires and the grates and the carrying, and for that she wore a plain print dress that could take the coal dust and the ashes and the water. In the afternoon, the heavy work largely done, she changed into a cleaner, darker dress, tidier and more presentable, often with a fresh white apron and cap for the lighter duties of needlework and answering bells. The change of dress was not for her comfort. It was so that, in the part of the day when she might conceivably be glimpsed by the family or their guests, she would look the part the house wished its servants to look, neat and proper and quiet, a pleasing background to the family's life rather than a working woman with dust on her hands. There was a whole etiquette to the servant's own world, invisible to the family and strict in its own way. The upper servants and the lower did not always eat together as equals. In many houses, the senior staff, the butler, the housekeeper, the cook, the lady's maid, would take the first part of their meal in the servants' hall and then withdraw, carrying the sweet course off to the housekeeper's room to finish in the dignity of rank, leaving the lower servants to themselves. The below-stairs world had its own precise order of precedence, its own high and low, mirroring the great division of the house on a smaller scale. A head housemaid like Maria stood well up that order, above the under-housemaids and the kitchen maids and the scullery maid, and the rank brought its small privileges and its real authority. The linen alone was a kingdom of its own. The sheets and cloths and towels of a great house counted, marked, mended, and accounted for. And woe to the maid who tore a sheet or lost a cloth without a good account of how. Nothing in the house was too small to be watched. The afternoon's needlework was often this endless mending, the patching and darning that kept a household's linen in service for years, a quiet, eye-straining labour that filled the hours between the heavy morning and the evening's demands. So the afternoon passed in the smaller labours, the mending of linen and the sewing that never ran out, the polishing of small things, the tidying, the constant readiness. It was easier on the back than the morning had been, and a maid might even sit while she sewed, which by the standards of her day was something close to rest. It was no easier on the clock because the bell still ruled it, and any of these quiet tasks could be dropped in a moment to answer a summons from above. And through the lightening afternoon, there ran an awareness of what was coming, because the largest event of the day, the one the whole house bent toward, was now drawing near. The light would begin to fail. The lamps would be trimmed and lit and carried from room to room. And below stairs, in the kitchen, the real engine of the evening would already be building toward its roar, because the family was going to dine, and the dinner was the thing the great house was built around. Chapter 9. The dinner the house was built around. The kitchen at Erddig stood at a distance from the dining room, and the whole evening turned on getting the food across it still hot. This was true of great houses everywhere, and it was no accident of building. The kitchen was hot and loud and full of strong smells, and the family did not wish to smell their dinner cooking or hear the clamour of its making. So the kitchen was set well away from the rooms where they lived and ate. The price of that separation was paid by the servants, who had to carry each dish the length of that distance, quickly and in order, so that food cooked far away arrived at the table as though it had been made in the next room. The evening meal was the great performance of the day, and the kitchen was its stage crew. As the afternoon wore on, the cook and her helpers built toward it, the range stoked, the pots at the boil, the courses timed to follow one another in their proper order. A formal dinner in a house of this kind was a thing of many courses, soups and fish and meats and game and sweet dishes, each needing to appear at its right moment, hot and correct and handsome. It took planning close to a military operation, and it took hands, the cook directing everything from the heat of the range, the kitchen maids fetching and chopping and preparing, the scullery maid at her sink scouring the growing mountain of pots and pans that a great dinner used up as it went. The kitchen at the height of dinner was the hottest, busiest, most pressured room in the whole house, and it was one of the rooms the family were most carefully kept from ever seeing. Then came the carrying, the nightly relay that the whole design demanded. The dishes went from the kitchen, along the service passage, toward the dining room, borne by servants moving fast so the heat would not leave the food on the way. In the dining room, the footman and the butler took over, setting and serving and clearing under a strict order of precedence, so that to the family the meal seemed to flow effortlessly, one course melting into the next as if by magic. Behind that smooth surface was a chain of running feet and lifted trays and split-second timing, the food handed from the kitchen's world to the dining room's world at the border between them, invisible from the table and utterly essential to it. A single failure in the chain, a cold plate, a late course, a dropped dish, would shatter the illusion, and so the chain did not fail. Here the numbers tell the tale of two houses under one roof. On one side of the green baize door, a dinner of several rich courses set before a handful of people, who might taste a little of each dish and leave the rest. On the other side, a working population that had laboured for hours to produce that dinner, and that would sit down afterward to something far plainer. And the two were joined, because the food that came back down from the family's table, the remains of the courses, was part of how the household below was fed. What the family left, the servants often ate, so that the same dinner served two households in turn, the rich one first and the poorer one after, on opposite sides of a single door, the abundance flowing downhill from the table that had first picked to the hall that took what was sent back. And when the family had dined and risen and moved to their drawing room for the evening, the servants' work was not over. It was, in a sense, only entering its longest phase. There was the clearing of the whole great meal, the washing of the countless dishes and glasses and pieces of silver, the scouring of the pots and pans, the wiping down and setting to rights of the kitchen for the morning to come. The scullery maid, who had risen before 5:30, was now at her sink again, deep in the evening, in the lamplight, working through the wreckage of a dinner she had helped to make and had not eaten. The dining room had to be restored to order. The fires had to be tended. And still, above, the family sat at their ease with their coffee and their conversation. And still the bell could ring and send a servant back up the stairs. The cook stood at the centre of this nightly effort, and hers was a position of real skill and real power below stairs. To send up a dinner of many courses, each hot and correct and to time, from a coal-fired range with no dial and no clock but her own judgment, was a craft learned over years, and a good cook was valued and paid accordingly, one of the most regarded and best paid of the women of the house. Beneath her, the kitchen maids learned the trade by doing the rougher parts of it, and the scullery maid did the endless washing that a great kitchen threw off. What all of them ate themselves was plainer fare, bread and cheese and cold meat, beer to drink, and the dishes sent back down from above. Good food, often enough, but never the food they had cooked and carried at its finest and hottest. The gap between what was made below and what was eaten below was one more version of the gap that ran through the whole house, and the heat of it all was punishing. The kitchen at the height of dinner, its range roaring and its many pots steaming, was among the hottest places a person could work, and the staff moved through it fast and sweating, while, a few rooms away, the family sat cool and served in the calm the kitchen's heat had brought them. For the maids and the kitchen staff, the dinner marked the point where the day should, by any fair reckoning, have been ending, and was not. They had been at work since before dawn. The heavy morning was long behind them, the afternoon labours done, and now the greatest single push of the day, the feeding of the house, was being cleared away in the dark by people who had been on their feet for the better part of a day already. Somewhere above, the last of the evening was unwinding gently toward bed. And only when the family finally went up, only when the last of them had climbed the grand staircase and closed a door, could the servants begin the very last stretch of their own day, the shutting down of the house and the long climb to their cold rooms under the roof. Chapter 10. A candle carried up after midnight. Only after the family had gone up could the last servant bank the fires, lock the house, and carry a candle to a cold attic room. The end of the servants' day was defined entirely by the families. As long as anyone above stairs was awake, the house had to be ready to serve them, and so the servants could not be released. They waited on the family's bedtime, as they had waited on everything else all day, and only when the last door closed above did their own day begin, at last, to close below. Then came the shutting down of the great machine. The fires that had burned all day had to be banked, damped down with ash and small coal, so they would smoulder safely through the night, rather than blaze unwatched or go wastefully cold. A small, skilled task, done last thing in room after room. The lamps had to be put out, and the candles snuffed. The doors and the windows of a large and valuable house, full of silver and pictures, had to be checked and made fast against the dark and against thieves. This was often the work of the senior servants, and of the butler above all, the last man awake, moving through the quiet house with a candle to see it made safe. The final act in a long chain of trust that ran from the family at the top down to the people who held the keys to everything they owned. For the housemaids, there was one last labour that mirrored the first. Just as the day had begun with hot water carried up in the dark, so it often ended with it. Cans of warm water taken up the back stairs a final time for the family's night washing, the last climb of a day that had been made of climbing. And there were the small resettings that made the next morning possible, the laying out of what could be laid, the quiet ordering of a room so that the whole enormous round could begin again in a few short hours. For the day that was ending was also, in every practical sense, the preparation for the day about to start. There was a strange peace in the house at that hour, the only peace of the day, when the family were abed, and the great rooms stood dark and empty, and the work was, for a few hours, done. The maid, moving through it with her candle, had the vast house almost to herself, and it must have felt in that moment like a different place entirely from the bright, demanding house of the daytime, quiet and still, and briefly unowned. But the peace was not for resting in. It was only the pause between one day's labour and the next, and the candle was needed to light the way to bed, not to linger by. And then, at last, the maid climbed to bed, and the climb itself carried the day's meaning in it. She went up the back stairs, the plain servants' stairs, to the attic floor beneath the roof where the maids slept two or more to a room, and she carried a candle because the passages were dark and the house saved its lamps for the family. The rooms she climbed past on the good floors were warm, heated by fires she herself had built that morning. The room she climbed to was not. The servants' bedrooms in the attics had no fires of their own, no comfort laid on, only a bed and a washstand, and whatever a young woman had brought with her into service. So the day that had begun with a young woman leaving a cold bed to make warmth for others ended with her returning to a cold bed, having kept none of the warmth for herself. The candle she carried was very nearly the only thing in that room that she had lit for her own sake, and it would be out in a moment, because morning came early. The securing of the house at night was itself a small ritual of trust. The butler, or whoever held the keys, went from door to door and window to window, and saw the silver locked away in its safe, and put out the lights, moving through rooms that only an hour before had been full of the family and were now dark and still. He was the last awake by design, the guardian of everything the family owned, and the fact that a servant was trusted with that duty says something about how completely the household depended on the honesty of the very people it otherwise kept at arm's length. Above him, under the roof, the maids were already asleep, or trying to sleep, in their shared attic rooms, 2 or 3 to a chamber, in beds that would have to be left again in a few short hours. There was no long evening of rest to look forward to, no leisure in which to spend the tiredness. There was only the short, dark gap between the last task and the first. A body worked as hard as this, day upon day, learned to sleep the moment it lay down, and to wake the moment it was called, and to carry a permanent undertow of tiredness as simply part of being alive. The young stood it best, which is one reason so many servants were young. The work used people up, and then, too often, let them go when they could no longer keep its pace. Now stand back and measure the whole of it in hours, because the measure is staggering and it is real. The scullery maid had been at her range by about 5:30 in the morning, and the housemaids had risen into the dark before that. And the day just described did not truly end until the family had dined at their leisure and gone up, and the house had been made safe, which could be well after midnight. That is a working day of some 18 or 19 hours, and on a heavy day nearer 20, from the first cold grate to the last carried candle, broken only by meals snatched standing and by whatever moments the bell happened not to claim. And it was not the exception, kept for a special occasion. It was the ordinary shape of the day, repeated 6 days out of 7, week upon week, with a single day of freedom in a month to set against it. That was what the wage of £20 bought. That was what lay behind the seamless comfort of the rooms upstairs, the warm fires and the hot water and the flowing dinner, and the house that seemed to run itself. It was this: a young woman climbing to a cold attic by candlelight, having given the whole of her waking day to a house that was built never to see her do it. And yet the story of Maria Wright does not end in that cold room, because the same rigid system that took her days also held, for the fortunate and the dogged and the well-regarded, a narrow way up and a narrow way out. Maria found both, and the finding is the turn her story now takes. Chapter 11. How a Housemaid Rose and Left. In 1899, Maria was promoted to head housemaid, over the place left by Eliza Sumpter, who had gone to marry the head gardener. That single sentence holds almost the whole of a servant's possible fortune, the 2 doors that could open in a life otherwise closed. One was promotion, a rise in rank and wage within the house. The other was marriage, a way out of service altogether. Maria, in the end, went through both, and the record is full enough to let the film watch her do it, which is a rare and precious thing, because for almost every other servant of the age, the door simply closes and the person is lost. Take the promotion first, because it was real and it was earned. Maria did not drift through her years at Erddig. She rose. She came in as a housemaid, one of several, and by 1899 she stood at the head of them, the senior of the women who cleaned the house, with the small authority over the younger maids and the better wage that came with the position. Her pay climbed alongside her rank, from £14 to 16 to 18 to 20 across those years. In a world with almost no ladders for a working woman to climb, she climbed the one she had been given, rung by rung, as far as a housemaid could go, and she did it in the ordinary way, by being good at hard work and being seen to be good at it, year after year. That advancement was not hers to grant herself. It came from above, from the woman who ruled the female servants, the housekeeper, Harriet Rogers. Rogers had herself risen through service to the most powerful position a woman could hold below stairs, keeper of the keys and the stores and the linen, and the arbiter of every maid's fortunes under her roof. It was her judgment that lifted Maria to head housemaid, and it is her voice that reaches us across the years, because when the promotion came, she set her opinion down in writing. She said she was so pleased to hear that Maria had been raised, and that she had always found her such a nice, clean, respectable girl. There they are again, Those 3 words: nice, clean, and respectable. The whole of a servant's standing captured in a private letter, and worth more to Maria's future than any single year's wage the house could pay. To have the housekeeper's good word was to have the thing that every next place would ask for. Now take the other door, the one Eliza Sumpter went through, because it explains how Maria rose at all and where she herself was heading. Eliza Sumpter had been the head housemaid before Maria. In 1899, she left the post to marry Alexander Sturton, the head gardener of the estate. Her leaving is exactly what opened the place that Maria stepped into. And in that small chain of events, one maid's wedding making another maid's promotion, is the whole narrow logic of a woman's options in service. The commonest way up and the commonest way out was very often marriage to a man of the estate, a gardener, a groom, a coachman, a blacksmith, and one departure rippled into a promotion behind it. The estate was a small world, and its households and its marriages were made largely from within it. For Maria, the same door was waiting, and she would go through it too, though not quite yet. Hold for now, on the shape of what the record shows, because it is worth seeing whole. Here is a woman who entered a great house at the very bottom, did the cold and invisible work this whole film has described, and yet was not broken by it, and did not vanish into it without a trace. She was promoted to the top of her trade. She was written down in a letter that still survives as nice, clean, and respectable. She had a name that the people above her spoke with real approval. In a system built to render her a function, a pair of useful hands, she had made herself a person of good standing, known and valued, and she had put herself in reach of the one thing better than a good place in service, which was a household of her own outside it. To be head housemaid was to cross a small but real line. Maria now had charge of the younger maids beneath her, set them their tasks, and answered for their work, and stood a rung nearer the housekeeper who ruled them all. The wage was better, the standing higher, the trust greater. It was as far as a housemaid could climb without becoming a housekeeper or a lady's maid. And for a woman who had come in at the bottom, it was a genuine achievement, won by years of the reliable, uncomplaining work that her betters mistook for mere good nature. But the estate offered a second ladder alongside the first, and it ran out of the house entirely. The men and women who served a great estate lived in a small, close world, and they married largely within it, maid to gardener, cook to coachman, housemaid to blacksmith. A wedding was the ordinary way a woman left service with her good name intact and a household of her own ahead of her, and the estate quietly produced these matches year after year. Eliza Sumpter had just made one. Maria, in a few years more, would make another. To the man who worked the iron in the smithy she must have passed 1,000 times. What drove her through the long years is not written down, but it is not hard to read. She wanted what most people want, a rise while she could earn it and a home of her own at the end of it, and she was steady and clever enough to reach both. That is the turn in Maria's story, the point where the long descending pressure of the working day meets the slow rise of her own fortunes, and for once, her fortunes win. She had climbed as high as a housemaid could climb. She had earned the words that were a servant's real wealth, and she was about to leave the whole apparatus behind. The 4 in the morning starts, and the cold attic, and the bell that could ring at any hour, for a life that would be hers to order. But her leaving belongs to the last chapter of this story, and before it comes, the film has to tell how the whole world she was leaving came, in the end, to an end itself, because the life of the great house was already, even at its glittering height, living on borrowed time. Chapter 12. When the great houses came down. The world that Maria served was already being undermined by forces far larger than any single house in Wales. Even as she rose to head housemaid in the last year of the old century, the ground was shifting beneath the entire system of the great house, and within a generation or two, the life she knew would be gone almost everywhere. The forces that ended it were economic and fiscal and human, and they arrived roughly in that order, each one pulling away another support from a way of life that had seemed as permanent as the hills. The first was the slow failure of the land. From the 1870s onward, British farming entered a long depression as cheap grain poured in from the vast new farmlands of America, and refrigerated meat came by ship from across the world, and the prices that British farmers could get for their crops and their beasts fell and stayed low. The great estates lived on the rents of their farms, and when farming stopped paying, those rents came under a pressure that never really lifted. The money that had built the houses and paid the servants and kept the whole edifice standing began, quietly and steadily, to thin, and a family whose wealth was all in land felt the ground grow less certain beneath them. The second force was the tax. In 1894, the government brought in death duties, a tax levied on an estate each time it passed from one generation to the next on the death of its owner. For families whose wealth was locked up in land and houses rather than in ready money, this was a heavy and repeating blow, falling again at every death, and forcing the sale of land, of paintings, of treasures, sometimes of whole estates, to find the cash the tax demanded. The great houses had been built on the quiet assumption that they would pass down the generations intact, father to son, century upon century. The death duties made that assumption first expensive, and then, for many families, impossible. The third force, and the one that struck the servant world most directly, was the drying up of the servants themselves. The whole system rested on a steady supply of young men and women willing to disappear into a life that began before dawn and ended after midnight for a few pounds a year and a single day off a month. As the new century opened other doors, in factories and shops and offices where the hours were fixed and the evenings were one's own, fewer and fewer were willing to go into service. Then came the First World War, which took the footmen and the young heirs alike away to the trenches, and many of both did not come home. After the war, the trickle of departing servants became a flood, as a generation of young women chose almost any other work over the attic room and the bell that never stopped ringing. The houses, quite simply, could no longer be staffed as they had been. For families of modest means, gentry rather than great aristocracy, these pressures bit early and hard, and the Yorks of Erddig were such a family. The record of the house itself is plain that by the early 20th century, the family was working to keep the place and its contents going with ever fewer servants, the dozen or more indoor staff of Maria's day thinning slowly toward a handful. And what happened at Erddig happened, more violently, across the whole country. The end of the story, for the great house as a way of life, was written finally in demolition. Through the 20th century, and above all in the 1950s, British country houses were pulled down in enormous numbers, unwanted, unaffordable, stripped of the servants who had made them habitable, coming down at the peak of it at a rate of about one every few days, a whole world of them reduced to rubble and memory. There was one other force at work in these years, and it rescued some of the grandest families while passing the smaller ones by. Across the closing decades of the century, a series of wealthy American brides married into the British aristocracy, bringing New World fortunes to shore up Old World estates that the failing land could no longer support. For a great ducal house, a rich American marriage could mean a new roof, a cleared debt, a reprieve of a generation or two. But this was a rescue for the very top of the tree, for the dukes and the earls with titles grand enough to be worth marrying into. A modest gentry family like the Yorks, with no title to offer, stood mostly outside it and had to meet the hard new century on the strength of its own thinning rents. The result was that houses like Erddig felt the squeeze sooner and sharper than the palaces, and cut their households first. And it was in exactly such houses that the old full staff of a dozen or more began earliest to shrink toward the handful that would limp on into modern times. So Maria worked at Erddig in the last good years of a system already quietly failing at its edges, in a house that would soon be keeping fewer and fewer of her kind, part of a great national workforce that would, within 2 decades of her leaving, begin to melt away for good. That was the world Maria stepped out of when she left service, though she could not have known she stood near the end of it, among the last generation to know the great house whole and working. The 4 in the morning start, the cold grate, the carried water, the answered bell, all of it was a system living on borrowed time even at its most magnificent. Within her own long lifetime, she would see the whole edifice crack and, in place after place, fall. And her own house, the one she had cleaned for 8 years, would come as close to destruction as almost any, and by a cause that carried a bitter kind of justice, because the thing that nearly killed Erddig was the very thing that had helped to pay for it all along. Chapter 13. The house undone by its own coal. In the end, Erddig was very nearly destroyed by the very thing that had helped to pay for it, the coal beneath its own floors. The estate had sat on the edge of the North Wales coal field, and mining royalties had been part of the family's income for generations. One of the 2 engines, along with farm rent, that had run the house and paid the servants through its good years. In the 20th century, that same coal turned on the house and very nearly pulled it down into the ground it stood on. First, though, came neglect. The Erddig of the middle 20th century was held by Simon Yorke IV, a man who set his face against his own age. He would not install electricity or the other modern comforts, and he let the fabric of the house slide slowly into decay while its rooms, left untouched, filled with dust and its treasures aged quietly in the dark. A great house needs constant care, the very care the servants had once poured into it every single day, and as that care fell away, the building began to fail from the inside, roof and timber and plaster, long before the worst blow fell. Then came the coal, and this is where the numbers turn grim. From 1947, mining shafts were driven directly beneath the house from the nearby Bersham colliery. The ground gave way. The house suffered subsidence of as much as 5 feet, sinking unevenly as the worked-out earth collapsed below it. The south wing began to drop. Cracks opened in the walls. Water came in through failing roofs, and wet rot spread through the timbers. A house that had stood for more than 2.5 centuries was within a few short years sliding toward ruin, undermined in the most literal way imaginable by the industry that had once helped to fill its coffers. The sight of it in those years was alarming. A house that had stood serene for centuries was visibly wounded, its floors no longer level, its doors sticking in twisted frames, its walls split, the damp working steadily into rooms full of furniture and pictures that had not been moved in generations. It seemed entirely possible that Erddig would simply be abandoned, left to fall, as so many stricken houses were in those middle decades of the century, when a great house was more often a burden than a prize. The colliery that had undermined it was part of the same long story of coal that had once helped make the family comfortable, so that the house was caught, at the last, between the 2 faces of the very thing that had built it. That it was saved at all was very far from certain. The rescue, when it came from the last of the family. Philip Yorke III, the final squire of Erddig, made the decision that saved it. In March of 1973, he gave the house, with all its contents and its whole surviving servant world, to the National Trust, the charity that keeps such places for the nation and opens them to the public. To pay for the vast work of repair, he sold estate land and raised about £1 million. The National Coal Board, whose mining had caused the collapse, paid about £120,000 in compensation and agreed at last to stop working the coal beneath the house. The restoration took 4 years of underpinning and drying and patient mending, and in June of 1977, the house was opened to the public, its doors thrown wide, by Charles, then the Prince of Wales. What makes Erddig matter, in the end, is what was saved along with the state rooms. When most great houses fell, the servants' world was the first thing to be lost, the kitchens gutted, the sculleries stripped out, the evidence of the working life swept away as worthless. When the Yorks handed Erddig over, they handed over all of it, the kitchen and the scullery, the bakehouse and the laundry, the servants' hall and the housekeeper's room, the labelled bells and the back stairs, and with them the wage books and the letters and the painted portraits of the servants themselves. The long habit of a family who had always recorded their staff became, at the very last, an act of preservation, and it preserved the proof of Maria Wright and everyone like her, the whole below-stairs world kept intact when almost everywhere else it was thrown away. To visit Erddig today is to see the reversal made complete. The National Trust shows the house from the servants' side, so that a visitor comes first to the working world, the yards and the outbuildings, the joiner's shop and the smithy and the sawmill and the stables, and then to the kitchen and the scullery and the servants' hall, before ever reaching the grand rooms the guests once entered by. The house is met, in other words, in the order a servant knew it rather than the order a guest did, and that is a deliberate and a rare thing. Along the way, the visitor meets the servants by name and face, in the portraits on the servants' hall wall and in the photographs of the whole staff gathered on the steps, one taken as far back as the 1850s, and another decades later, with a long poem written to go with it. And behind all of it survives the archive, the wage books and the letters and the accounts. The paper record in which a young woman's £14 rising to 20 and a housekeeper's warm sentence about her can still be read more than 100 years on. Almost nowhere else in the country can the two halves of the great house be seen so nearly whole and side by side. The gilt and the grease, the state bed and the scullery sink, the family that was served and the people who served them, all kept under the one roof they always shared. So the house that was built to hide its servants ended by becoming the one place that keeps them best. The coal that helped pay their wages nearly destroyed the building, and the rescue that saved the building saved, almost as an afterthought, the entire below-stairs world it contained. Erddig came within a few feet of collapse, and it survived. And because it survived a housemaid's single day can be walked, room by room, more than a century later, by anyone who cares to see it. Which leaves only the last question the film owes her, the question of what became of Maria Wright herself, and of what her side of the door has to tell the crowds who now pass through it. Chapter 14. Her Side of the Door. In 1902, Maria Wright left service to marry Joseph Wright, the blacksmith of the estate, at St. Giles Church in Wrexham. With that, she walked out through the second of the two doors open to a servant and into a life that was her own. She had come in a housemaid from Chester, risen to head housemaid, earned the words that were a servant's true wealth, and now she left the cold attic and the 4 in the morning starts and the bell behind her for good, to keep a house of her own instead of another family's. She married a man of the estate, as Eliza Sumpter had done before her, and in doing so she took the commonest and the surest way out that her world allowed. Her life after service was long, and by the measure of the world she left, fortunate. She and Joseph had 2 daughters, one born in 1904 and one in 1908. She lived on through the fall of the whole world she had once served, through 2 wars and the demolitions and the slow ending of the great houses. And she died in 1958 at the age of 84 and was buried in the cemetery at Wrexham, a few miles from the house where she had once risen in the dark to lay the fires. She was not a symbol, and the film should not turn her into one. She was a woman who worked and rose and married and raised her children and grew old, and whose name we happen to know when a million others are lost. She could be known at all because of the strange kindness of the family she served. The Yorks, for 200 years, did the thing almost no other family did. They recorded their servants, they painted them and hung the portraits in the servants' hall, and wrote rhyming verses about them, and photographed the whole staff on the steps of the house. The oldest of those portraits went back to the 1790s and showed an aged servant named Jane Ebrell, the house's spider brusher, the maid who had swept the cobwebs from its high ceilings, honoured in her old age at 87, with a painting and a verse that called her the mother of us all. Because the Yorks kept such records, the servants of Erddig did not vanish the way servants almost everywhere else vanished, into unmarked graves and forgotten names. They were written down and remembered. Maria was written down. That is why she can be more than a shadow on a back stair. But the same records hold a darker story, and honesty requires that the film set it beside Maria's, clearly marked as coming after her time. A few years after Maria left, a woman named Ellen Penketh came to Erddig as cook and rose to be its housekeeper. When the household accounts fell into confusion, the family accused her of theft. She was prosecuted and put on trial, and a jury acquitted her, finding her not guilty. And yet the acquittal did not save her, because a servant who had once been accused, even a servant cleared by a court of law, had lost the one thing she could never truly replace: her character. The good name that was a servant's whole wealth, once stained, could not be made wholly clean again by any verdict. Penketh's story is the shadow of Maria's, the same ladder ending not in a wedding and a long life, but in ruin and disgrace. And it stands as a reminder of how narrow the path really was, and how completely a servant's fate rested on the goodwill of those above. Hold the 2 of them together, because between them they hold the truth of the whole system. The good name that lifted Maria and the lost name that ruined Ellen Penketh were the very same currency, the character, 3 words in a letter, given or withheld by the people who held all the power in the house. Maria earned hers and kept it to the end. The housekeeper's phrase for her, nice, clean, and respectable, outlived the wage book and the working day and the house's near destruction by coal, and it is the reason why, on the far side of a century, a young woman from Chester can be a real and named person rather than a nameless pair of hands. The words that ruled her life also, in the end, rescued her from being forgotten. It is worth saying plainly what her long life meant, set against the odds of her trade. Many servants never married, and grew old alone in other people's houses, or in none. Many broke their health on the work, and had little to show for it at the end. Maria married at 32, made a home, raised 2 daughters into the new century, and lived on into her 9th decade, dying an old woman among her own people rather than a worn-out servant turned off when her usefulness was spent. Hers was, by the hard measure of the world below stairs, a life that ended well, and the record is full enough to let us know it, which is rarer still than the good ending itself. And so the film ends where it began, at the door. Erddig stands today, saved from the coal that nearly took it, kept by the nation, its whole hidden world preserved intact. The crowds come, thousands of them, and they walk into the great house to admire the gilt and the silver and the state bed behind its rope, much as the family once meant visitors to do. But the house keeps another story now, the one it was built to hide. It keeps the kitchen and the bells and the back stairs she climbed. It keeps the wage book with Maria's £14 rising to 20. It keeps the letter that called her respectable. The door she was never allowed to use now stands open to everyone. And at last, the great house tells its story from her side of it, across a single ordinary day, from the first fire to the last candle. If Maria's day stayed with you, subscribe, because the people who ran these houses left more names behind than anyone expects. And this channel is where their stories get told. Then tell me one thing in the comments. After walking through her day, whose side of that green door would you have wanted to be on? And why?